This happened to me when I was in my early 20s, while house sitting for my parents for a few days while they were out of town. It was the middle of winter and the house was fairly remote. There were still neighbors, but the properties were spread out so that you couldn't really see any of the other houses through the thick surrounding trees. It was a beautiful spot, but I admit, felt a little isolated and creepy staying there alone. I'm a night owl, and I'd been enjoying one of my usual nights of late reading. I sat by a large window that faced the backyard, which led out to a forest ravine. I wrapped up around 2 a.m. and walked towards the kitchen to pour a quick glass of water before heading to bed. Most of the lights in the house were out, except for the soft glow of a lamp that I'd been reading under, and some dim under-cabinet lighting in the kitchen. As I made my way over, out of the corner of my eye I caught a glimpse of light near the front entryway. Through the tall, narrow window next to the front door, I noticed that the motion-triggered porch light had come on. I then noticed something that disturbed me to my core, and I froze mid-step. There was a shadow of a person through the glass. The window was frosted, so I couldn't really make out what they looked like, but I could see his face staring straight in at the spot where I stood. After a moment, I think I noticed him even lean in a bit closer to the glass, as if he was trying to get a better look. My skin crawled. I stood there frozen in fear, contemplating whether he could actually see me or if I was hidden enough in the darkness of the hallway. But there was light behind me, so I was sure that he'd seen motion as I'd moved across the hall. The man then reached down and tried the door handle. Panic caused my throat to seize up, but thankfully I'd remembered to lock the door. My fight or flight response kicked in, and I choked out the words, "I see you, what are you doing?" My voice was shaking. The person remained silent and just continued to stand there, seemingly unfazed. I continued, "I'm armed, and you're trespassing, leave now." But I wasn't armed. Moments later, the stranger's silhouette slipped away into the darkness. After a few more seconds, the automatic porch light turned itself off. I stayed frozen, standing in that spot for what felt like 10 minutes. I was afraid to take my eyes off that front window. I eventually calmed down a bit, but was now wide awake and there was no way I was going to be able to sleep. For all I knew, he could still be out there just waiting for the lights to go out, signaling that I'd gone to bed. I turned on a few more lights around the main floor and returned to the living room to binge Netflix until dawn. As morning broke, I pulled myself off the couch in a sleep-deprived state and walked over to the front door just to peek outside. I'm not sure what I was looking for, but I also wanted just to breathe some fresh morning air. When I opened the front door, my blood turned to ice. In the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, I could make out the footsteps of the man who'd been at the door. Except they weren't alone. There were 3 sets of prints, all with distinctly different boot treads. 1 at the window, and 2 off to the side where I wouldn't see them. I followed the tracks, which led back down the steps and around the side of the house, and it just kept getting worse. The tracks led into the backyard, up to each window, and then to the back door, but then stopped at the living room window right outside where I'd been watching TV. I could tell they'd lingered there, as there was a large area of snow trampled down, more than anywhere else. The tracks eventually led off through the yard and into the ravine, but I didn't follow them farther. I'd left the blinds in the living room window open last night. The realization hit me like a kick to the gut. For God knows how long, or why, they had watched me. I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. Groggy and disoriented, I glanced towards the source of the noise, and I could make out the figure of a man with his head partially leaning into my bedroom looking at me. As soon as I turned my head towards him, he quickly left. I figured it was just my housemate getting home late and checking if I was still up. He often got home late, but usually wouldn't disturb me at this hour. My clock radio displayed 3:27 a.m. What concerned me was that he didn't knock before entering and then just left the door open, letting a thin sliver of light spill into my room from the hallway. I called out, "Yo, could you close the door again?" He didn't answer. His footsteps just slowly led away down the hall. I was too tired to care, so I turned back over and quickly fell asleep. I got up around 7:30, and I went to my housemate's room to give him heck about waking me up in the middle of the night for no reason, but discovered that the door to his room was wide open, and the room was empty. I was the only one home. It was unlike him to be up and out so early, especially after getting home so late, so I texted him saying, "Hey, you're up early. By the way, what did you want last night?" He responded about 5 minutes later with a question mark. "You poked your head into my room at like 3:30 in the morning," I texted back. He replied back immediately, "What are you talking about? I just woke up. I'm still at my girlfriend's." I felt a heavy weight drop to the pit of my stomach. Someone else had been in the house last night while I slept. I panicked, my first thought being that we might have been robbed. I checked the house, but nothing was out of place. In fact, all the doors and windows were still locked, with no signs of break-in or tampering. The realization hit me that whoever looked into my room might still be in the house. A wave of fear and panic swept over me, and I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. I slowly and carefully checked every room, closet, and hallway, on guard to meet an intruder at any sudden moment. But nothing. There was nothing missing or out of place, and no sign that anyone was or had been in the house. This fact did not calm me, since my mind only raced with more questions. When my housemate eventually got home a few hours later, he was extremely creeped out by what I told him, but laughed it off, saying that I must have just vividly dreamt the person peeking into my room. We dropped the matter, but I knew it wasn't a dream. My door really was open a crack that morning when I woke up, and I never leave it open. There are no drafts that could have opened the door. I wasn't drinking or on any substances. No one has a key to the house except for me and my housemate. Somehow, someone else was in my house that night. It happened during a particularly cold winter night, and a thick blanket of fresh snow had just fallen. My roommate was out of town for the weekend, so I was home alone, taking advantage of the solitude to catch up on some work. After a few uninterrupted hours, I started to hear a very faint scratching sound. It was an old house, so at first I chalked it up to the usual settling noises an older home tends to make, especially in extreme temperatures. The scratching persisted, and then it started to have periods where it would become louder and quite erratic. I decided to investigate, though somewhat reluctantly. Part of me was creeped out at the chance it was rodents in a wall somewhere. The other part of me knew in my gut that the sound was a bit too intense to be the light scurrying of rodents, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it really was. As I quietly and carefully paced the main floor listening, the house felt different. I don't really know how else to describe it, but the air held a strange tension, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. It almost felt like there was a presence, like I wasn't alone. At one point, I even called out my roommate's name on the chance they had somehow returned home without me noticing, but there was no answer. The scratching led me to the basement door. Of course, it has to be down there, I thought. Nope. And I swiftly returned to my room and shut the door. But a few minutes later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to the basement stairs. The scratching continued until I was about halfway down, but then suddenly stopped, as if it had sensed my presence. I descended another step and waited. Silence. Another step, then another. The scratching abruptly intensified, more than ever, making my heart flutter and skip a beat. I froze in place, with now one foot on the concrete basement floor, and my eyes still adjusting to the darkness as I felt blindly around the wall for the light switch. My hand found the switch, and a dim yellow glow flooded the basement. I jumped a bit as the source of the noise revealed itself. A small, disheveled gray figure huddled in the far corner. It was a stray cat. It sat there shivering, back arched, and its eyes reflecting the fear that mirrored my own. It must have sought refuge from the bitter cold and found its way into the basement through a crack or gap. I cautiously approached, speaking softly to reassure it, and attempted to coax the cat towards me. As I moved closer, my reflection emerged in a large mirror leaning against the wall to my right, And this is where things took a terrifying turn. As I glanced towards the mirror, I caught a glimpse of a reflection that didn't belong to me. A few seconds of confusion turned into intense terror as my mind made sense of what I saw, and I screamed. The reflection in the mirror was of a large, bearded man huddled against the opposite wall near a cluttered old clothing rack that was next to the exterior door that led outside and up to the backyard. My heart was racing, and I stumbled towards a wall opposite of the man, instinctively and frantically feeling for something I could use to defend myself. But the man remained sitting, huddled against the other wall, and had raised both of his hands up in a defensive pose. He quickly spoke. I'm sorry, I just needed out of the cold. I'm sorry, please, I just needed out of the cold." I noticed that the sudden commotion had sent the cat running to the man, now huddled in a ball under the edge of his ragged coat. "What? Is that your cat?" I stuttered, my voice shaking. He nodded and repeated, "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was home, we just needed out of the cold." It turns out that the man was homeless, and he'd found his way in through the exterior basement door that apparently had been left unlocked. I ended up making the man some tea and heated him some leftover takeout. I set out a can of tuna and a bowl of water for his cat. I felt weird about him staying, but worse about the thought of sending him back out into the bitter cold. I offered him a camping cot in the basement, which he took me up on. I didn't get much sleep that night, my mind on guard at the fact that there was a stranger sleeping just a floor below me, and there was no locked door between us. But I must have drifted off for an hour or two at some point, because I suddenly awoke to the break of dawn through my window. I quickly stepped out of bed and went to check on the man in the basement. He'd already gone, but left a small torn piece of paper on a neatly made up cot, which simply read, "Thanks."